So we're going to talk about infant mental health. One of the first questions we get asked is, why would a baby need a psychiatrist? And it's pretty simple. If we think about infant mental health, and I help you break it up, an infant refers to a baby between the ages of 0 and 3. Mental refers to their cognitive, emotional, and social domains. And health refers to the well-being of babies and their families. So the concept of infant mental health refers to the baby's capacity to regulate, to express, to develop and experience their emotions, to form secure relationships with significant others, to allow them to adequately explore and learn from their environment. And why are we interested in infant mental health? Because infant mental health is essentially the building blocks to your future. And it leads into the concept of the first 1,000 days of life. The first 1,000 days of life is not really about the time since delivery going forward. It actually starts before that. When you decide to have a baby, when we're in the process of conception, we need to be really aware of all the risk factors, but also the potential benefits of how we emotionally plan to bring forward the best infant mental health in our offspring. So the reason we're interested in infant mental health in the first 1,000 days is because we understand that infant development is actually more than just one single thing. It's a continuous production between your biology, your phenotype, your experience of the world, how you are mothered, and how your environment negotiates your life going forward. And the reason you need to be particularly careful about it is because early experiences matter. Charles Zeanah, who is a really experienced and well-respected child psychiatrist, says, the earliest experiences are those that fundamentally lay down the building blocks for how you are able to develop optimally for the rest of your life. So what does that mean? Things that happen to you as a baby influence how you see the world. It influences the expression of your genes. It influences the structure of your brain. In your first 1,000 days of life, your brain is starting to develop with neural connections at more than 1 million per second. And if at this rapid rate of development, we have influences like stressful events or happy events, these would naturally influence how you're able to better regulate these genes. So let's talk about stress. Not all stress is bad for a baby or for a developing fetus. There is a variety of stresses that actually can be good for a baby. If we think about stress, stress can be tolerable, stress can be toxic, or stress can be normal. So what is normal stress, you ask? A normal stress would be the experiences that a baby or a developing brain would have that strengthens it, that better prepares it for the world. An example of that would be an unavoidable circumstance like going to the dentist, or having a mom really stressed out in traffic, or having to be in a situation where you're running late for something and everyone around you is really stressful. In the presence of a good caring relationship, of a caregiver that is able to negotiate the stress, you bounce back. A baby learns to be resilient because bad things happen, but we get over it. Moderate or tolerable stress that moves on from normal stress would be events that are unpredictable, such as a death of a significant other, a natural disaster, a road accident. This has the potential to disrupt your brain architecture. But once again, in the presence of a caring, nurturing environment, a consistent caregiver, your brain is able to bounce back and recover. Which brings you to the point of what we want to avoid when focusing in the first 1,000 days. The concept of toxic stress. So toxic stress would be, in severe forms, neglect, abuse of a child, emotionally not being able to regulate a child. But it doesn't really need to be something physical. It often can be an exposure to an adverse event repeatedly in an environment, such as domestic violence, such as really acrimonious divorce settlements, relationships that are colored by foul language, by inconsistent caring, by fights, by environments that are unpredictable. And the reason we worry about this is in the absence of a buffering relationship. We have a potential to scar for life your developmental trajectory. So we go on talking about a buffering, caregiving relationship. What is it? We know that John Bowlby, who was the fundamental forefather of attachment theory, which is sounding quite complicated, but it's quite simple. It's a behavior pattern that allows a person to form a close and loving, caring, reciprocal relationship with another person who is better conceived to cope with the world. So that's a really important thing to remember. You don't have to be better able to cope with the world. Your baby needs to believe that things will be okay, that you can, and that when push comes to shove, you're able to rise to the occasion. Linked very closely to that is attunement. And attunement is this reciprocal connectedness between one human being and another. It's the fundamental cornerstone of evolution. We need this reciprocal connectedness between mothers and babies, fathers and babies, caregivers and babies, between other human beings, so that we trust, that we're able to rely, and that we're able to negotiate life going forward. We also need to remember something really important, and that's the last of the theoretical bit of the first 1,000 days. And that is, there is no such thing as just a baby. Babies are part of a relationship. One can never talk about a baby needing help without us being able to reflect on the mom, the caregiver, the father, the relationship, and the environment. So if we understand that attachment is about relationships with the caregiver, why do we need attachment? We are essentially hardwired for relationships, and attachment patterns affect the behaviors of young children. So if a child is afraid, and if they can't go up to their significant attachment figure, sooner or later their normal strategies for coping become overwhelmed. And if they're overwhelmed, psychological defenses take over, and we're more likely to have a very clingy baby, a baby that's unable to separate from its mum, or a baby that's really needy, even at times where other children seem to be quite resilient and relaxed. So the question you then would need to ask is, are we really expecting a mum to be that significant, reliable, consistent, understanding caregiver all the time? Not really, because attachment is not just about the primary caregiver. It is about the mum, it is about the mum or dad for that matter, but it's about secondary attachment figures, which could be the nanny, your domestic worker, a grandparent, another caregiver in the house, and a tertiary attachment figure is equally important, and that would be significant other people in the environment, a creche teacher, a neighbor, a family member, someone who is able to take over that responsibility of sole caregiving should something happen, as might do in a normal set of environments. So what can we as parents or as significant caregivers or significant others do to ensure that we are promoting attachment and attunement? It's a hard one, because there is no right answer. There is no set of rules that says, if I follow rule 1 to 10, this makes me the best mother, the most attentive, the most attuned, and my child has a beautiful platform for the rest of their life. It is mostly about being good enough. In fact, babies do surprisingly well when mothers, for the sake of this example, are authentic. None of us in a day-to-day situation are happy and super excited and reliable and understanding and consistent all the time. That's not what makes us human, and it's not what makes us authentic. Babies from a very young age have the capacity to be able to recognize when there is an authentic emotion, when there is empathy, and when there is a situation where mum pretends to be better coping than others. And why is this important? This is important because we need to always self-reflect. As caregivers, you need to be consistently showing children that there is a range of emotions that promotes good attachment and good attunement. And that means being able to demonstrate to babies who from a very young age learn by mimicry. They need to recognize that when someone is sad, they may be withdrawn, their affect may be slightly restricted. You may tear if something makes you sad. If you're happy, we express it in a way that we smile, we experience a pleasurable moment with the significant other, to almost express it as genuineness. And this is important because mums often read books, or they watch television, or they might Google certain instructions on how to be the perfect mother. And a lot of the time, you're misrepresenting to your baby what a perfect mother is. The first thing to remember is there is no such thing. The second thing to remember is a perfect mother would be a real mother. And a real mother has a range of emotions: sadness, happiness, boredom, discontent, being able to be just satisfied, being calm and expressionless, being able to be real to that baby is what promotes that consistent, understanding, empathic responsiveness, which is important. If someone had to ask me what would be the essentials of having a well-attuned mother and baby, I would say it would be a mum who is able to recognize when a baby is distressed, a mum who is able to back off when a baby gives an indication that the stimulation is too much, that the proximity of the relationship is overwhelming. I would think a mum who isn't able to just ignore a child who is crying, whether they are wet, whether they are hungry, whether they are tired. But it's also a mum who allows some capacity for a child to self-regulate. And if a child is unable to self-regulate in the first 1,000 days of their life, it really sets up a disadvantage for that child to negotiate their environment later on in life. So when we think about self-regulation, what do we mean? We mean it's the baby's capacity to self-soothe, to recognize when they have physical and emotional capacities that make them unable to calm down. And how does a mum know that? It really depends on the developmental age of the baby. So a practical example would be, there's this common urban legend that you have to leave a baby screaming and crying in a room with a closed door because it teaches them how to self-regulate. That baby should not be spoiled because we have to constantly pick them up. I would suggest that before we decide what is right or wrong, we need to ask, where is this child developmentally at? So if a child is under 10 months of age, neurologically and biologically, they're unable to self-regulate. And that's a really important concept to remember. That does not mean that each time a baby cries, we need to pick them up and shake and soothe and feed and pat and disrupt their regular rhythm. But it does mean that the baby is calling out for a reason that it is unable to communicate at that point because of their developmental milestone. So a 10-month-old baby who is struggling to sleep, who is crying, who is whimpering in bed, may not need its mum to pick it up, but actually needs to hear the soothing voice of the mum, needs a rocking motion, needs to smell the proximity of that significant caregiver to teach them how to self-regulate. That's very different for a 2-year-old who may be screaming, throwing tantrums, spinning around in their room, wanting some excessive stimulation when it's past their bedtime. Self-regulation there is important for a different reason, because a child who is feeling overwhelmed and distressed needs to reset their internal physiological distress mechanisms. And self-regulation there would be really important for a mum to leave them in a quiet space, to be clear that they're not being abandoned, but they're getting a time to calm down. And why we make this distinction is because if you aren't able to teach your child or your infant self-regulation at a very early age, what it essentially does is allows you to develop into a child, into a teenager who needs constant feedback, constant soothing, constant stimulation. So when we ever look back and we say, why do children these days get bored or need to constantly be given something exciting to do? It's because very early in life we can almost track that in the first 3 years of their life, they were constantly regulated. There was an excessive amount of external stimulus. So the important take-home message is, ask yourself what is normal developmentally or at this stage in their life. And a kind of rule of thumb would be, if a child is under 10 months, they aren't able to regulate themselves. If a child isn't able to feed, to sit on their own, to dress, to be able to maneuver themselves out of danger, then they need their caregiver a little more in order to help self-regulate. So in summary, if we think about attachment and attunement and the importance of relationships, the key messages to remember is that there is no such thing as a good enough or excellent mother. It is a mother who does the best for their child, a mother who is reliable, who is consistent, who is empathic and responsive. And that is essentially the fundamental building block for building resilience later in life.